Good morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our video for this week going over hurricane season. It is April 13th, Saturday, 2024. And as you can see by the title card, hurricane season is now fast approaching. We have a lot to talk about this week, including talking about the climate models and new predictions that have released as well. And we'll also go over ENSO and the typical stuff we go over too this week. But a lot to get to. First off, our countdown till June 1st. And when I say that hurricane season is fast approaching, it definitely is. Only 49 days now till we get till June 1st. And that is less than 50 days, and that is certainly less than 60, which is only 2 months. So we're now solidly under 2 months away from the hurricane season. And before you know it, we're almost into mid-April. And once April is done, we only have a month left. And then before you know it, we'll be in the hurricane season. So definitely a lot coming up for sure. Really quickly though, since it is still not hurricane season yet, let's see what's going on across the globe. Well, there's not much going on across the globe anyways. Just wanted to show you that we do have storms that occur in the general realm of the tropics outside of the northern hemisphere, especially outside of the Atlantic, as after all, it is the southern hemisphere tropical cyclone season. Although that is also almost coming to a close, so they're not really seeing much in terms of activity right now, and we'll probably continue to see this as we head later into the month of April and eventually into the month of May, and then the southern hemisphere will die down completely and we'll begin to see our transition into the northern hemisphere. Going over sea surface temperature anomalies for this week. One thing very important to mention, very warm. Just how it's honestly just incredible how warm the Atlantic has remained throughout the whole entire winter and so far into the spring. And I actually talked about this on my Twitter, I think 2 days ago, but it really is incredible. And I should have shown some sort of comparison between how we look now versus how we looked at the beginning of the year. But it's quite incredible how we have been able to maintain such warmth in the Atlantic since the beginning of the year. Really, we've been able to maintain anomalies solidly into the more formidable end of the scale instead of just seeing some of these weaker positive anomalies like we see maybe in the ENSO region, and soon we'll see some of these cold anomalies soon. We're actually going to get to that in just a moment, but we see all these warm anomalies, especially some of them that are actually a lot closer to the top end of the scale. And then we also notice how cold the subtropics are, and they've actually been cooling over the last recent week or so. This is just a classic look, honestly, for a really active hurricane season. Cold directly over the very warm waters of the tropics helps consolidate all the energy in the tropics, and but on top of the fact that we have a developing La Nina, which now we can say that for sure because La Nina has actually really been coming on recently over the last week or so. The El Nino has really died out, and this is a stark difference from just the beginning of the month. And I'm actually going to show a comparison. This is April 1st. And now let's go back to present day. This is April 12th, updated as of yesterday. Notice just how much warmth we've lost over the equatorial region of the Pacific and how that's basically reversed now completely into a cooling phase over the Pacific. We've seen a lot more of these cold anomalies from the eastern Pacific begin to spread. We saw that it was just confined just near South America at the beginning of the month now as we're heading into mid-month. Very interesting. Atlantic obviously has remained very warm, but just look at how much heat we've lost in the Pacific. And believe me when I say that this will only continue over the next several weeks. And before you know it, by the time we get to summer and especially fall, we'll probably see a full-blown La Nina in effect as well. It just goes to show that the climate models were indeed right when it comes to La Nina developing, and it certainly seems like they'll continue to be right. And that just sets the stage further for hurricane season this year. And it's also very interesting. The northern Pacific too has kind of cooled down as well. with the PDO, that's something else to watch, and we'll watch that over the next several weeks because that is also a factor into hurricane season. But just look at this since the beginning of month, and we can even stretch it out all the way to the beginning of the year. Look at just how much we've fallen off with the ENSO. In January, mid-January, we were just coming off the peak of this El Nino, so right near 2 Celsius. And now look at where we are present day as of April 12th. Let me see if this updated yet. Actually, yeah, it's updated. April 13th. I mean, it just goes to show the same thing. We're right near really strong El Nino territory. This was in mid-January, and now here we are almost mid-April, and we're now almost completely down there. We're down below 1 Celsius, so that's below the moderate threshold for El Nino. So we really are weakening now, and these trends are only continuing. And as for the MDR, let me refresh this since this updated too. MDR2 has actually seen quite a bit of cooling over the last week or so. Some increased trades we've had over the general MDR, including portions of the Caribbean too, because this is the MDR, and the typical MDR kind of includes the Caribbean as well as the actual MDR. But in terms of the Eastern Atlantic, the eastern portion of the MDR, too, factoring in the Caribbean and the deep tropics as a whole, obviously trades have increased over the last few weeks, so we've kind of seen things tank. But if we look, it's still really warm. It's still really warm out here. We still have very strong positive anomalies throughout the deep tropics, and especially now that we're in April, there's really no way we're gonna see a considerable amount of cooling enough that the MDR will just turn completely cold. At this point now, since it's April, it's kind of not possible anymore since we're less than 2 months away from the hurricane season, and usually around this time is when we start seeing things in place. But really quickly, back to that El Nino. Kalen Paddle too. I found this very interesting. He talked about this earlier this week on Wednesday. But this has to do a lot with the development going forward of how the Pacific will shape up in terms of, this developing La Nina. But he mentioned earlier this week that the models, especially the GFS, had a really strong westerly wind burst in the equatorial Pacific in terms of the zonal wind anomalies. And suddenly, he mentions that up until a few days ago, or at least at this time in April 10th, and it's probably downtrended even further, they completely backed off on that westerly wind burst. And very interesting too, if you look at the top end of the scale, the top end of the model, which is a lot closer to present day, you notice all these blues. So no wonder why we've seen lots of cooling recently in the equatorial Pacific. And then he mentions we should see the Nino 3.4 as a result of this continue to cool heading into late April. And then he goes on to mention that the weak westerly wind bursts we saw, so I guess we go back to this map, it kind of explains why we saw an increase in the Nino 3.4 for about a week or so within the last week of March. And then he mentions that, yeah, the westerly wind bursts, because that was westerly wind bursts that occurred, it eroded some of the subsurface cooling when we switched into April, into the very beginning of April. But then he mentions over the last few days, those trade winds have basically reversed. And now you notice how we're basically the subsurface cooling is now beginning to return. We see this is April 4th, so this is basically right at the beginning of April, from late March. Just want to show you, this is late March, and then this is early April, and then now this is much more closer to the time this tweet was made, which was April 10th, so earlier this week. The subsurface the cooling below the surface, the subsurface cold pool. So basically all the anomalies below the surface, which is what this map shows, below that cold pool, which is going to help develop this La Nina, is now recharging. And you can only imagine this is gonna further begin to surface along the equatorial region, and before you know it, in a few weeks, we will have La Nina, a full-blown La Nina, and that'll absolutely set the stage for what it seems like will be really favorable and a very active hurricane season, because we saw the new predictions come out this week. We went over Colorado State University, which they came out last week. So they came out in time for us to be able to talk about it last week. But new predictions have released this week as well on Monday, this past Monday, TSR, which is tropical storm risk there in Britain, I believe, the UK, and then the University of Arizona. Basically, well, first of all, TSR is identical to CSU in its numbers completely. 23 named storms, over 20 named storms, and I believe their ACE index as well from TSR is over 200. So just like CSU, and then University of Arizona came out on the same day, and they released predictions as well. A lot of people release a lot of predictions, especially this time of year. This time of year is the year that all the predictions tend to come out, which is why there's always a lot to talk about, especially in April, even though we're not yet into the hurricane season. But interesting, with all the predictions that have come out, they're all unanimous, basically, in what they show. All three agencies show the exact same hurricane and major hurricane counts. University of Arizona was like, I'll go maybe a little lower name storms. Maybe they didn't just want to be the exact same as CSU and TSR, but I think the general consensus is they're all agreeing that this season will be very active, that it just looks favorable for this hurricane season, and it just looks like this year could take off. There's a lot of potential, and that's what all the agencies are recognizing. And obviously, they probably looked at some of these climate models too that came out and made that assumption as well, because this is the C3S model. This is for August of this year. And just look at it. This is August, and then let's even go into September too. And just look at these 2 months. These are the two biggest months for the hurricane season. And just look at all this precipitation we have throughout the Atlantic. It just looks very favorable. We have precipitation especially focused in the deep tropics, especially off the eastern Atlantic and off the west coast of Africa. So this probably means there'll be a strong monsoon, stronger waves as well. And it looks, as I said last week, kind of looks just exactly like a one-seat ticket straight into the western Atlantic, which indicates the deep tropics as a whole will be favorable, and that's actually increased the talk, at least this week, of what does that mean for impacts in the Western Atlantic. And Danny Morris actually went ahead and talked about this yesterday, and he mentions bearing subseasonal variations in August, September, in which the Azores high temporarily weakens. Both, then he's going by the CANSIPs, by the way. But all the models basically show this, and I show the C3S because the C3S is like the NMME, and it kind of shows it's kind of a consensus model of all the climate models put together. But anyways, back to Danny in the CANSIPs. He shows bearing subseasonal variations in August and September, in which the Azores high temporarily weakens. They both show a prolonged positive NAO for both August and September, the two most active months in the hurricane season, and that enhances the risk of tropical cyclone impacts for the Antilles and land masses further west. And the continental United States pattern will determine whether or not we see pattern impact for the continental United States as well. But generally, he mentions it looks like there could be an increased risk as well for areas further west, including us where we live, because most of us, especially that track these storms, we all live in the western part of the Atlantic. None of us really live out here unless you live in the Cape Verde Islands, or maybe you live in the Azores, but the majority of us where we track these kind of storms, most of us either live probably along the East Coast. Definitely a lot of people in Florida. I know Danny Morris lives in Florida, and a lot of people we follow, like Andy Hazelton and such, they live in Florida too. Definitely along the Gulf Coast too, especially over the last few years. But you get it generally. Gulf Coast, Mexico, these islands, they all have populations of people. And so a lot of people are paying attention to this. And it's one thing when we have an active hurricane season, but just everything goes out to sea. There's really nothing significant that year. but it's active. That's basically like a 2010. But it's another thing when all the models show activity plus what seemingly is a favorable pattern in which a lot of them show activity going into the western part of the Atlantic too. And if you can go back to the C3S, Cancip shows a stronger ridge, which is what Danny mentions. And then what does the C3S show in terms of precipitation? They also show seemingly probably a stronger ridge pattern because they all have the Caribbean and especially Gulf of Mexico, the Western Atlantic as a whole, really active. And is there actually a 500 millibar height thing to this? Yes, there is. And even we could compare this to what the Cancip shows. This is August of C3S, and then this is the Cancips for August too. Very similar ridging pattern too. Very strong ridge over North America. And you could kind of just get the idea that a lot of the models are showing kind of what would seemingly be, and this is especially for September, that's very strong. Very classic ridging look. I mean, it's just all the models, they're all very, very confident that this year could be not only active, but potentially really impactful too. And especially given now that we're in mid-April and the models are still showing all of this because they were showing this since the end of last season, since last year ended, everybody started pointing to all the models showing this kind of look for this year too. And the fact they still show it and it's April, we're going to have to watch really closely to see what happens this season. And obviously we'll see a lot of more predictions come out. And we'll also get our climate models to come out in May too. So we'll see if there's any changes between now and then, but I doubt it. But because of this, everybody's releasing their predictions. And all of them too are also showing the same thing. And they're basically all saying the same thing, that the Western Atlantic and especially with Colorado State University, they had 125 ACE or something like that, west of 60 West, so the Western Atlantic. They all show very active and potentially very impactful too. And I know a lot of people have been questioning, what do I think and what are my predictions? Well, I'm here to tell you right now that they are coming out this week, in fact, on April 17th. I'm going to release my predictions for the hurricane season. So like we see everybody releasing what they think and everybody sharing their thoughts, their 2 cents into the hurricane season, I will do mine. And I'm not trying to be some sort of, grand like forecaster or meteorologist like Philip Klotzbach is, or people at University of Arizona, or even people like Joe Bastardi are. I'm just, giving my 2 cents of what I think this hurricane season could be like. Nothing more, really. And that's coming out April 17th. So if you're interested in knowing what I think in depth of how this hurricane season could be like, stay tuned. If you're new to the channel and especially you want to see my predictions, I recommend you subscribe. And not only subscribe just for this video, but subscribe because I'm doing videos every single week. And very soon, now that we're in mid-April, and before you know it, in only a month, we'll be in mid-May, and the Eastern Pacific starts their hurricane season in mid-May. And around that time, I usually switch from doing just weekly discussions to videos, sometimes every day, starting as soon as mid-March, starting as soon as mid-May, not mid-March, mid-May. Mid-March is a little too early, but we're now past that. Crazy, we're already past March, and soon we'll be into May, and soon before you know that, we'll be in June, and hurricane season will be upon us. But that is still some time away, and there's still some time for things to change, but at least with the trends that we see right now, I doubt it, so we'll have to see. But anyways, that is going to wrap it up for this week. If you like what you saw, I really would appreciate it if you give a like, and if you comment, and if you especially subscribe, would always appreciate it. And it also helps build our community that we have here on YouTube. But always like seeing more people, because as always, the more the merrier, right? At least hopefully. But thanks for watching. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to everybody that's watching, and we will talk again very soon.